Support for this program is provided by the Foundation for Excellence in Louisiana Public Broadcasting and from viewers like you.
Hello and welcome to Louisiana Public Square. I'm LPB news anchor Natasha Williams. We're delighted to be coming to you from the Coughlin-Saunders Performing Arts Center in historic downtown Alexandria. We chose to travel to the heart of the state to discuss a topic that affects many economic sectors, the trade war with China. As a candidate, Donald Trump won over the Rust Belt states by promising to revive American factories. As president, he has implemented tariffs to help domestic steel producers and to combat unfair trade practices by China. But what are the consequences? A recent study ranks Louisiana among the 3 top states most vulnerable in a U.S.-China trade conflict. Over the next hour, we'll explore Louisiana's winners and casualties in the trade war and how the state's addressing tariff tensions.
Today we celebrate the amazing workers at Sempra Energy as you open the Cameron LNG export facility for business. I've never seen a thing like this in my life. This is incredible.
In March, President Donald Trump toured the Sempra liquefied natural gas facility in Cameron Parish. The visit came a day after the administration's trade war led China to raise tariffs on LNG imports by 15%. So far, Louisiana's LNG industry is standing strong. Greg Bowser is CEO of the Louisiana Chemical Association.
A lot of them have contracts in place to buy the LNG that we ship out. And so I don't know if it will impact those contracts. It just depends on how they're negotiated. They may be somewhat protected or insulated from it.
The tariffs are affecting Chinese investment in the state, Bowser says.
When you're building a chemical manufacturing plant, you have a lot of steel and things that go into it. All of those things would be subject to a 15 or 25% tariff. And so that's going to have an impact on how quickly or whether or not people make investments. So far, it hasn't stopped it, but it's really slowing things down.
The trade war has also put some expansion projects in limbo.
If you had a facility that you were building here in Louisiana and you're about 80% complete, and then all of a sudden the tariffs go into place, well, the numbers that you use to run to make the calculation are out of whack now. What do you open that facility? Do you mothball? What do you do? Those are the kinds of conversations that are going on right now.
While increased tariffs on imported steel and aluminum have helped domestic producers, they've hurt businesses that rely on these imports. Don Fowler is president of AFCO Industries, headquartered in Alexandria.
AFCO is a manufacturer of products for the home building industry. We've been in business in Alexandria, Louisiana since 1946.
The employee-owned business brings in aluminum from China to manufacture its building materials. Since May of last year, the metal has been the subject of a 10% tariff.
This year, AFCO is on pace to consume about 17 million pounds of aluminum. So the 10% tariff on that aluminum is pretty significant in terms of our bottom line.
Fowler's biggest concern is that tariffs aren't being applied fairly. Currently, competitors who import the finished goods that AFCO manufactures are exempt from any tariffs.
It really gives them an unfair advantage in that they can go into our customers with the exact same product that we manufacture that they've imported from China, and they can go in at a much lower cost. And as efficient as we are as a manufacturer, it's very difficult to overcome that advantage.
This imbalance is primarily impacting AFCO's manufacturing plant in Mississippi, but could ripple across the entire operation.
We supply aluminum from this plant to that one. So if our competitors are allowed to continue to operate the way they are and not be subject to any tariffs, it could certainly impact our business at that plant, which ultimately would have an impact on what we do here and certainly at our other plants.
Bayou Steel Group, the largest employer in St. John the Baptist Parish, filed for bankruptcy at the end of September. While the company hasn't given a reason, Governor John Bel Edwards blamed tariffs as the culprit. In 2018, exports to China, which had been the state's biggest trading partner, dropped by more than 60% due to the trade war. The 25% tariff on soybeans significantly hit Louisiana farmers. China was the state's largest export market for the crop.
It's definitely a dark time in agriculture in Louisiana as well as in the United States.
George LaCour took over the family farm more than 30 years ago when his father passed away. G&G Farms has grown to 10,000 acres with 5,000 devoted to soybeans.
We grow cotton. We grow 1,000 acres of cotton. We grow 1,000 acres of corn. And we grow about 3,500 acres of sugar cane and 400 or 500 acres of wheat and about 400 acres of crawfish. So we are diversified.
LaCour has seen fellow farmers go out of business this year due to low prices and bad crops. In a sector that needs new blood to replace aging farmers, the trade war has intensified the problem.
If you were a young beginning farmer today, I don't think you could get financed. And to make it work at these prices, it doesn't have enough return to make a living.
LaCour will be down about $250,000 in bean revenue this year. While he receives federal aid from the $16 billion Federal Market Facilitation Program, it's far from covering his losses. But despite their impact, LaCour still supports tariffs as a way to force China to trade fairly.
I'm an American first. I'm a farmer second. Understand the need to have a fair playing field because the U.S. produces more ag products than it consumes. So we do free trade all around the globe. We just prefer fair trade.
There's no winner in this situation.
Fait Korai is the chair of the economics department at LSU. While he understands the administration's concerns with unfair trade practices by China, he says tariffs are not the answer. While they help some producers, Korai says you must look at the overall economy, and the current outlook is grim.
What we are estimating is there will be a decline in GDP by about 1%. And since we are now at a point where the economy is slowing down, this may be something that will tilt the economy towards recession.
Well, joining us to give us their outlook on the issue is our audience. It includes representatives from the Louisiana Farm Bureau Foundation, Alexandria manufacturers and retailers. We also have two members of the Louisiana Legislative Youth Advisory Council from Alexandria and Shreveport. In August, just over a year after the trade war began with China, the Pew Research Center released results of a survey of Americans about the issue. Among their findings, 60% of Americans have an unfavorable opinion of China, a 14-year high. 26% of respondents have a favorable opinion of the country. Asked the status of the economic ties between the U.S. and China, a total of 53% of respondents say they're bad. A total of 41% say they're good. Back in May of 2018, just a few months after the tariffs kicked in, a Pew Center research survey found that a majority of U.S. adults, 56%, say free trade agreements have been a good thing for the country as a whole, while about 30% say they've been a bad thing. So let's start with our own survey. What are your views of the current battle with China, and what effects are you seeing in your area? Danielle, let's start with you.
Well, as of right now, I can't speak for anybody other than agriculture. That is what our family does. We produce row crops and cattle and pecans. What it has done to us is actually just been the icing on the cake for what was a really bad 2018 harvest season. Then you had a bad 2019 planting season. It was just really the icing on a cake, and it wasn't just our soybean crops, even though that's what the huge tariff the tariff war is about. Mm-hmm. It was our cotton and our corn as well.
Ryan, could you add to that?
It was a perfect storm coming after the Midwest having a horrible crop year, and then when the tariff situation came on, the quality of the crop wasn't great, so exports weren't going to their normal points. They flooded straight down to the Mississippi River, straight down to Louisiana, and Louisiana's the bottom of the funnel. And when the funnel stopped up, it affected everything and it started moving north. So Louisiana suffered exponentially because while we had the closest point to deliver our goods and our products, we had no place to go. We were there left sitting on our hands and nothing to look forward to. Inclement weather hurt us, and then as the weather hammered us down as far as our quality. The prices started falling, budgets started getting broken, and it left us looking towards the future of where do we go from here?
Tell us about your farm. Where is your farm and the name of your farm?
We are, Danielle and I, we own and operate Tariff Farms. We are located in Colfax, Louisiana, the dead center of the state. We operate with my parents who operate Keystone Farms. Together we farm right at 3,000 acres of row crops. Of that row crop, about 2,000 acres of that is soybeans. So that is a huge part of our income and what we make our living of. So whenever the tariffs came into play, it really made every single day volatile. Just this week alone, we've watched market volatility between talks between China go up and down. We've seen over 25 cents a bushel on the soybean market, up and down, up and down. It gains and it drops.
So you really have no idea?
We really have no idea. Budgeting has been thrown out of the window. While we had the best budget set in the world when we started this year, they're null and void now.
When we load our 18-wheelers to go to market on an afternoon, the price can be changed by the time we deliver the next day.
Oh, wow. Okay. Well, thank you for sharing. At this point, Jim, I'd like to get your opinion.
Sure. Well, I think you've done a great job of setting the stage between the manufacturing story in the lead-in and having Daniel and Ryan up first. That's a good picture of what's going on in central Louisiana. Not all of our manufacturing operations are directly affected. But what we have seen, and we hear this from national players, from site selectors, is that the uncertainty is hurting everything. We know of a number of major investments that could be coming to Louisiana that are not coming right now because of the overall uncertainty. And I think the thing we hear most often is the business sector wanted the president wanted the national government to act on China and some other unfair trade agreements, but the solutions that are being driven at this point look like hammers when more surgical instruments might be appropriate. And I think just the overall level of uncertainty, the left and right announcements in back-to-back weeks are far more damaging than any individual intention of what we're trying to achieve as a nation.
First, tell us who you are and who you represent.
Yeah, I'm Jim Clinton. I'm with Central Louisiana Economic Development Alliance. We do economic development in 10 parishes in Central Louisiana, and our principal goal is to drive up median family income.
And did you feel somewhat, I guess, a sense of comfort when you heard of a possible truce on Friday?
Well, yes, but we've heard that a lot. So my comfort is not going to come until we achieve some stability, until we know that our farmers and our businesses can plan and have some sense of confidence that they can make decisions and hire people, create jobs and opportunities, and know that they have a high likelihood of succeeding.
Okay. And Joyce, you're right beside him. You're in the retail segment of this, so tell us about your feelings.
I have a 72-year-old store with furniture, appliances, and gifts. And the products that have really been affected are the products with steel, the adjustable beds, bed parts, parts for furniture. The other is the manufacturers of appliances that either use parts or importing parts, or importing refrigerators. Refrigeration is a big, air conditioners, many are made in China, along with cost-effective refrigerators, and you add the tariff and they're not so cost-effective.
So that means something big for the consumer.
It's every day. And every day a new email with how the manufacturers are strategically building their defenses to, we get price sheets now that tell us what country the item comes from. The invoices that we get have a a tariff added to the bottom if there is one. The tariffs are charged separately by item.
How does that affect what you charge? So the consumer prices?
Have to factor it in.
Percentages?
Same formulas, just you start with a different bottom line to
Does it go up 5%, 10%?
5 to 10, depending on what it is.
And that could go, like, any day it could be up 5 to 10%. Wow.
We recently received our Christmas packages for 10 tea sets for children. Some of them as much as $10 an increase.
Wow.
If we actually do it, then the question is, will the customer pay pay $49 for a child's tea set? And so we have to make that decision in how we market it. But it's an everyday thing. Almost every day there's an email regarding the tariffs and how different companies are handling it.
Wow. Let's go over on this side. Anna, could we get your perspective?
So far it has not affected me directly, but it could impact job opportunities in the future, seeing that many jobs are being pushed overseas. And being set in an unstable economic environment, it could be shaky seeking jobs in the future for a lot of the youth.
Okay. How about you, Robert?
So I've grown up with both my dad and my grandfather. They own a wholesale company that mostly wholesales different types of like sporting goods, but as well like rubber boots for both oil field workers and agricultural workers in Louisiana and around the South in general. And so just talking to both of them recently, they've told me just that they've seen both their, what they're purchasing from manufacturers has increased, but also the people they're selling to, the quantities have been limited just because, you can only employ a limited number of like oil field workers now when tariffs like that have been increased, or when, the agricultural system, they've also seen a reduction in like how much goods they're intaking from like wholesalers like my family.
Wow. Jim, could we hear from you? Tell us who you represent and how you're affected.
Well, I'm retired from Louisiana Farm Bureau and currently have farming interest. I guess my point is that it's not just China. We're dealing with USMCA, which is the Canada and Mexico agreement, which hasn't been approved yet to replace NAFTA. We're dealing with the European Union, which is having their own problems between the rest of the Union and the United Kingdom on Brexit. We just signed a trade agreement with Japan, individually with Japan, but that meant that we got out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. So it's not just that. It's a world. We have begun a worldwide trade war, and the uncertainty, as we discussed earlier, is really just whipsawing a lot of people through no fault of their own. They're doing what they normally do and as efficiently as they can, but we're blowing in the wind here.
Okay. Mark, could I get a perspective from you?
Okay. My name is Mark Vassar. I'm with Integrated Packaging Corporation, and we are manufacturers of corrugated products. So it's kind of really affecting us on both sides, on the supply chain side with our raw materials, and then also with our customers. On the supply chain side, China is a big exporter for paper in our industry, and when that funnel slows down, it starts impacting prices as we start looking at kind of like the farmers were talking about on raw materials. And then on the revenue side, what happens is with some of our multinational customers that are heavily weighed with their business coming from international sources, especially China, when these tariffs start taking effect to their business, it starts affecting our business.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. That's all the time we have for this portion of the show. When we return, we'll further explore tariff tensions with a panel of experts. Welcome back to Louisiana Public Square. Tonight we're exploring the trade war with China. Joining us now is our panel of experts. Stephen Barnes is director of the Kathleen Blanco Public Policy Center and associate professor of economics at the University of Louisiana at Lafayette. Dr. Barnes also serves on the Louisiana Revenue Estimating Conference, the panel that sets income projections used to create the state budget. Andy Brown is an assistant commodity director and national affairs coordinator for the Louisiana Farm Bureau Federation. Among other commodities, Mr. Brown tracks issues related to soybeans, wheat, feed grains, forestry, and water resources. Scott Poole serves as Chief Operating Officer for Roy O. Martin, an Alexandria-based wood products business. Mr. Poole is the past chairman of the Central Louisiana Manufacturers Council and serves on the executive committee of the Louisiana Association of Business and Industry. Saul Newsom is an attorney and founder of Newsom International Law, a firm devoted to providing legal support for international commerce and investment. Newsom was appointed to the Department of Commerce to the Louisiana District Export Council and sits on its outreach committee. Before we go to the audience questions, if each of you could briefly answer from your perspective how the state of Louisiana is faring in the current trade war with China.
Well, I think there's no doubt that Louisiana has been negatively affected. We've really felt the impact of this trade war. Tariffs can be linked to specific industries, but as time passes, we see those effects rippling through the economy and taking hold in a broader way. That's both across business as well as the impact to consumers in the marketplace.
Okay, Mr. Poole?
Well, in our industry, the market's bifurcated between softwood and hardwood, and most of the softwood products are sold domestically. So the net impact is really negligible from a softwood standpoint, but quite different from hardwood. This time a year ago, we were exporting right at $2 billion worth of product to China. Today, it's 1.3, and that represents about 650,000 jobs and a huge part of our state's resource.
Mr. Brown?
From an agricultural perspective, I think the term tip of the spear would be a way to analyze how Louisiana's facing these tariffs and this trade war. There's no market that's larger for many of our commodities than China, which has had the largest tariffs imposed from this trade war. So when you look at the main commodities in Louisiana, number one being soybeans from a row crop perspective, China dominates that market at 60% consumption of the world's soybeans. So when you look at that and you compare that also with the market facilitation program, which is the trade aid program that USDA has provided our farmers, you can see from the rates of that program that Louisiana is towards the top of that list as far as rates go. So while that's good to have that program, when you're at the top of the list for an aid program, that means you're getting hurt the hardest.
Mr. Newsom?
The big thing is uncertainty. A lot of Louisiana businesses, as they're looking to either grow their export products or are looking to plan their next year, they're looking for predictability as far as the regulation or predictability as what the market's going to do. And a lot of these trade talks and these potential trade agreements have been announced and then they've fallen through. And U.S. regulation is not only affecting trade, but there's also regulation affecting foreign investment in the United States, particularly in critical areas in Louisiana dealing with our maritime ports and close to our energy sector. And so that sort of unpredictability is challenging Louisiana businesses. They're trying to plan and to try and grow, and it's hard with not knowing what the market's going to do and not knowing what regulation and additional red tape they're going to have to go through as they plan to grow.
Okay. Mr. Harper, let's go back and talk to audience members now. Your particular perspective, how has this affected you? Tell me who you are and who you represent.
Thank you. I'm Jim Harper. I'm a farmer from Cheneyville in Rapides Parish. I'm here tonight representing the Louisiana Farm Bureau. I'll give you a China perspective. In 2017, we shipped over 700 million soybeans to China. In 2018, we shipped 21 million. Our cotton exports to China are projected to be cut in half. We've sold China no poultry since 2015, and we have a 47% tariff on U.S. beef going into China. We finally got the Chinese to agree to give us a chance of selling them some rice before the tariffs took place. If we could just get 10% of their import market, it would be a 500,000 ton amount that we could ship to them. I think most farmers support the administration's efforts to get China to live up to the agreements they've signed, but it is really causing a lot of pain in agriculture, and I hope soon we can get an agreement.
Could you tell us, what is your question for the experts?
My question is, how has the tariffs affected the ports of Baton Rouge and New Orleans?
Well, I can jump in from a farmer's perspective or agricultural perspective. 40% of the commodities produced in this nation flow through the ports here in Louisiana. So when you look at that and the impact that has, not just here in Louisiana, but nationwide, and to see the reduction from that you spoke of $19 billion in 2017 value down to $9 billion in 2018, and we're $1.3 billion behind that pace this year. You multiply that out with 40% of the commodities in the nation, and that's a very large billions of dollars of impact. So that was very evident in 2018, which I think we've referenced here tonight. When you have a plug in the bottom of the funnel, as Mr. Yerby spoke of, that backs up for the whole nation. And so that continues to prove true in 2019 and will continue so until we have resolution.
So, Sandra, we'd like to talk with you. Tell us who you are, who you represent, and tell us your concerns and the question for the panel.
Yes, ma'am. So I'm Sandra McQueen. I'm the executive director of England Air Park. England Air Park was created when the former England Air Force Base closed. So we were the entity that took over all those assets, and our primary mission is economic development. So where we have been looking at this issue is, are there ways we can help educate the business community, because our job is to protect and grow the economy here, but can we educate them on mitigation strategies for the tariffs? So primarily what we've been looking at is, we hold the foreign trade zone for Rapides Parish, and are there ways we can work with especially manufacturers that are impacted to create subzones, and that would allow them at a minimum a cash flow opportunity, because they could delay payment of the tariffs until the goods leave the trade zone. Perhaps you could reduce the tariffs because they would not have to pay them on scrap, as opposed to paying for the full price when it comes in. So that's been our approach, is what can we do to educate and mitigate the impact.
What is your question for the experts?
My question would be, and it may be for the lawyer on our panel, is what strategies are you seeing that being employed, the mitigation strategies throughout the state of Louisiana, and what type of strategies are you seeing?
Yes, it's a great point. The mitigation strategy is a great way to try and soften the blow of some of these new regulations, and taking advantage of the free trade zones. Also diversifying the markets. We've already seen this where exporters are looking to try and find new consumers, to try and find new markets that they hadn't been in. There's a lot of folks that, because of the trade tensions, that are now being shortfalled on some of their commodities, and so there's new opportunities for Louisianans and Americans to export into new areas to try and find and diversify where they're selling their products. The other thing is to take advantage of the U.S. Export incentives that exist out there. There are incentives that exist through the Tax Cut and Jobs Act that was passed in 2017, and other export incentives that have been around for decades to try and incentivize and really assist exports in the U.S. and perhaps offset any of the losses that are coming as a result of tariffs.
Dr. Barnes, could you add to that?
Sure. I think your question highlights something that's worth emphasizing, which is one of the things that's made all of these recent changes particularly challenging, is the pace at which radical changes are happening. So people like yourself, who are working to attract businesses and help businesses figure out how to navigate these changing policies, it just takes time to learn exactly what the rules will be and exactly what does apply, and what we've seen is, fairly quickly, maybe things end up getting pulled off that list. So it's been a really tumultuous time with a lot of changes, some in the direction of more tariffs, sometimes pulling back, which I think is part of what's made it so much harder to plan, especially for larger investments to really grow the economy over time.
Anybody else on the panel?
Yeah, but in a lot of our international contracts, there is fine print that says if there's an imposition of tariffs or levies or duties on the product, the buyer is responsible. So when you mention education around the subject, I think it's very important that we make people aware of the fact that just because you were okay yesterday doesn't mean you're okay today. And guess what? If there's a duty or tariff on that product or component or piece of machinery, it falls on the buyer. So what you thought you had, you may not have next time.
Okay. So Philip, could you give us your perspective, how it's affected you, and your question for the panel?
Okay, my name is Philip Lamartiniere. I'm a rice and crawfish farmer from Marksville. And as far as the tariffs, anyone in agriculture has been negatively impacted, no doubt about it. And to reinforce on what some of the speakers said before, that in agriculture, we're price takers, we're not price makers. So as compared to someone that's in a manufacturing business that's producing a product that they can maybe tack on an extra 4 or 5% to help tide themselves over, we don't have that option. I can't call Farmer's Rice Mill and tell them, hey, look, guys, I got to have a little bit more money on my rice because of the tariff. And I know that even in a business situation that's not sustainable in the long term, but short term, at least it gives you a footing to keep on. So that's one of the biggest obstacles that we endure, is that we're at the mercy of the markets. Second thing, China, the government of China is not our friend. And they have been abusing, and they're not the only ones. There's some other countries we're not going to talk about, but there's other countries that have been bad actors when it comes to trading. And this is the first administration that has been able to hold them or attempt to hold them accountable, because this is something that hasn't happened overnight. We've been having trade issues with other countries for years, but I have to give them the credit that they've been able to try to step up and do the right thing. It's a bitter pill to swallow today, but we hope in the long run we're going to see some relief.
So do you believe it will help? I mean, what about the people who are going out of business? What about people who are closing shop because of the tariffs, because they can't afford to stay open?
I feel for them, and that's not just in business. Agriculture is faced with the same thing. There's people here today that when they try to do their crop loan and do their budget like Mr. Yerby talked about for the upcoming year, they're not going to cash flow. They might not get a loan. They might not farm next year. So that's why we've been fortunate that we've had some government assistance through the MFP program to kind of help tide us over to try to make the ends meet to where we can potentially farm again next year.
Do you have a question for the panel?
Well, my question, and I think one of the gentlemen maybe answered it partially, was that you keep hearing about the billions of dollars that have been collected from the tariffs, and my question is, can some of that money be used to help create or enhance other markets for all affected commodities?
Is that something, Dr. Barnes?
Sure. I think, talking about the revenues that are generated through tariffs is I think a useful thing to keep in mind as an important ingredient in this overall puzzle. It's certainly true that when a tariff is imposed, that's going to shift, who is selling in the market and shift the prices that consumers are paying. But along with that shifting is usually, generally, an adjustment in how much is exchanged in the market. And so what we see with that is typically the shifting from international producers to domestic producers. That can be beneficial to certain industries, but comes with that changes in prices, which affect other industries as well as consumers. And as a whole, when we look at it economy-wide, that change in prices and that change in activity tends to be a bigger decrease for consumers in terms of purchasing less than the revenues generated through the tariffs. So there's something we call in economics a deadweight loss, and that's lost economic value because we've inserted this tax of sorts in the middle of the market. Now, that being said, there is a substantial amount of revenue being generated, and I think it absolutely makes sense at a minimum to think of how we can target those revenues back to those most affected by the tariffs. But the real answer is find a way to get those tariffs out of the way so that we can really let the market do its job.
Mr. Newsom, can you add anything to it? Is there any legal way that you could possibly find out where that money is and have it channeled in a way that would help area folks?
There may be a process for that, and in fact, the aid to the Louisiana farmers is really the first instance that we've seen for some of that coming back to some of those folks affected, and we expect to see that in some of the other industries. I know that for importers of steel, there was a process to try and get a waiver to allow other countries to bring in or to directly import and to be able to import that steel duty free. And so there are processes that are for relief there, but as far as actually getting access to those dollars coming back, the farmers' aid is the first one we've seen come back.
Okay. Robert, let's go to you. Tell us how you've been affected. First, tell us who you are, how you've been affected, and your question for the panel.
My name is Robert Duncan from Boyce, Louisiana, Rapides Parish. Me and my family, we farm 450 acres of soybeans, and we have beef cattle as well. The biggest thing for us, in 2016, we were farming just shy of 800 acres. And as a beginning farmer, it was tough to get that loan. And then in 2018, with the markets, it was almost detrimental. We had to get away from our rent land and pick up just what we owned. And so it hurt us. And then, with the markets, the tariffs the way they were, we had a decent crop, but we couldn't get rid of it. We couldn't sell it because of the tariffs. And so we ended up leaving 50% of our acres unharvested in the field. Insurance helped a little, but not enough. The MFP payments were great on harvested acres. That has since been revised to planted acres. But it can always be more, but I believe it's a necessary evil. We just got to get through it.
Your question for the panel?
So as Mr. Harper, it was very close to his question. As far as the ports in Baton Rouge and in New Orleans, how is it going to affect in the long run? Are we going to feel a long run effect with personnel? Are they going to be able to replace those people? Do they have to lay anybody off with the cutback? Are they going to be able to replace them? Is it going to affect in the long run?
So just last week, I was able to meet with the Port Association of Louisiana, and the Port of South Louisiana was there, and they were speaking about the health of the ports. And thankfully, because of where Louisiana is located geographically, and we have the heart of the Mississippi coming down through the center of the country, we're in a position where commodities, regardless of whether they're coming out of Louisiana or they're coming out of the Midwest, it's the cheapest place to export out of. And so thankfully, Louisiana still, its ports will remain healthy because it's still the cheapest place to export out of. And going rail to the east or going rail to the west is much more expensive. And so I expect, and I think their projections were that they'll still continue to remain healthy and should weather this storm all right. And thankfully, some of the ports over to the west are dealing with the LNG and some of those exports that are growing now. And so as a whole, the ports are faring better off than sadly many of the farmers are in the state.
Mr. Brown, would you like to add to that?
Yes, I would say that the concern would be more globally as far as relationships, the business relationships with other countries, their dependence and their faith in American products, American commodities. We're proud, I know, as farmers here in the room, of the product that they provide, the safety, the cost, and so there's a lot of farmers' dollars spent, the taxpayers' dollars to maintain those business relationships. You look at probably the biggest competitor for ag commodities, nation to nation, would be Brazil. And you see a lot of Chinese investment in Brazil to bring them up to speed, to have the infrastructure, to have the port structure, to be able to ship the product that they grow. And the longer a trade war like this goes on, the more our relationships deteriorate while they have the opportunity to catch up and build that infrastructure to bring them to a more competitive advantage against the United States. So while domestically we can maintain that through other products, it's the international relationships that really suffer.
That's a great point. And as those relationships start to grow, it's going to be harder to shift back because it's another shift and there's a cost associated with shifting. And so as companies start to realize that perhaps investing or doing trade with just one single country in a large, in large quantities is risky business. And so it makes sense to diversify just like you would in any other investment or any other business.
So basically, because they can't get products from us, they start relationships with other countries.
Right.
And then it will be hard for us to get them back.
Possibly, right.
Well, and as Mr. Monroe spoke of earlier, this isn't just a single nation that we're having this issue with. There's the four biggest trading partners for agriculture in the world are all facing disputes when it comes to trade right now. So when we have things like the USMCA, the Mexico-Canada agreement, a Japan deal, negotiations with EU, that's where a lot of frustration comes from domestically, is that we can't count on our own Congress to pass trade deals like the USMCA that is really a no-brainer with our two largest trading partners. So there's things we can do domestically to relieve some of this pressure, but when politics get in the way, that's when we really see frustration from our farming members.
Okay. Joyce, I'd like to get your question from a retailer perspective.
So the question is, for the forestry folks, where do you see our forest and our wood going? And is it coming back, or now we're seeing so many products with reclaimed wood, and that's because there's not a flow somehow.
Well, I'm sure you remember when there was a tremendous amount of furniture manufacturing on the East Coast. I mean, you go to South Carolina, North Carolina, that's where most of our furniture came from. That industry is gone. And it went to China. And a lot of it went to China. So what we're seeing today, as an example, let's take wood panels that go into upholstered furniture. The upholstery is stitched and sewn actually in China and shipped back. But due to the tariffs, the Chinese companies, along with some American companies, are going to Vietnam and establishing the manufacturing sites and then shipping it to the U.S. And what that does is increases the price. You lose that chain of custody, and really your prices are going to go up and your sales should go down as a result of that, unfortunately. As far as the chain of custody on our hardwood lumber, it's diminished so tremendously that they've turned to other countries to supply those. And that market may not come back, at least over the next decade, because just like we're talking about transitioning from country to country, and other hardwood suppliers are stepping in to fill that role. And unfortunately, then our products, we have to find other markets, other end users to occupy that same space, and they're not always readily available.
What happened to that North Carolina market?
They lost to a cheaper labor market. And as that, and probably to some degree regulations, but normally those jobs follow the labor market. The cheaper labor is where they went to, and it all went offshore. And a lot of our lumber went offshore, like I mentioned earlier. $2 billion annually was being shipped to China, and now that's almost cut in half.
Wow. Mark, do you have a question for our panel?
Yes. I think, and I'm piggybacking off what one of the other gentlemen said about the this situation that we've been in, and I just heard what you said, Scott, and I agree with the furniture industry. I've seen the same thing in the steel industry. I'm originally from the Midwest. We saw that there with steel being unbalanced and losing that market in that area. But as we see the changes that have been made, and as an attempt to right this wrong, so to speak. But we see the effects that it's having. And even though, it might be easy for some people that's, not directly experiencing it, but for the people that's experiencing it and going out of business, it's a real issue, right? I mean, it's something that needs to be done now. And I'd just like to get the panel's outlook or opinion on how you think maybe this could have been done in a way where something needed to be done, but maybe what has been done, and I'll pick it back what Jim said, is more of a hammer than a surgical tool. What's your comments on that, and how do you guys look at it from your own perspectives?
Dr. Barnes?
Sure, I think that's a really good question. I think I've heard some comments along the way about the importance of doing something, and I can certainly appreciate that there clearly has been a need to address some misbehavior, so to speak, especially on the part of China with regard to intellectual property. But I think doing so requires developing thoughtful policies, and as an economist, when I'm looking at any question, I'm often sort of challenging myself to not just think about the direct effect of a policy, but how are people going to respond to that, and who else is going to be affected. And I think a lot of what we've talked about today, when we think about tariffs as a tool, we could think of the first tariff really being on imports of steel. That was a commodity where there were concerns about dumping of steel in the international market. And so, yeah, that might benefit steel producers here in America, but who else is affected? Well, all of the users of steel, which turns out to be a much broader segment of industry than the steel manufacturers, not to mention the consumer side of that equation. So I think really addressing the challenges requires pinpointing what are the most pressing things that need to be fixed and developing targeted policies that really get specifically at that, rather than, I think the approach that's been taken is much more general negotiation using leverage from these blunt instruments of tariffs. And along the way, where a lot of industries are feeling a lot of pain, and that's time that we can never get back.
I think along those lines also, these processes probably should have been taken earlier, by earlier administrations, perhaps when the concerns started to arise. It's a challenging process, and it's not very politically favorable. I mean, it's hard when you're taking away anyone's industry, or you're starting to pick winners and losers as to who's going to be affected. The other thing perhaps would have been to delay some of these things, so that maybe we're not doing all of our tariffs all at once in a short period of time. But again, politically, from an administrative standpoint, they've 4 years, there's no guarantee of a re-election, and so I think that perhaps there was the idea of we need to strike while the iron's hot, we're going to move right now. As far as an alternative, there was a law that was passed last year called the Foreign Investment Risk Review Modernization Act, and there was a joint law, a sister law passed called the Export Control Reform Act, and both of those laws were specifically passed with China primarily in mind, and the idea was to prevent China's acquisition of critical technologies or foreign investment into critical infrastructure in the United States. And so while it doesn't necessarily address the steel concerns and losing the steel industry, what it was intended to do is do what the rest of the Chinese tariffs are intended to do, which is penalize China for trying to take aggressive or predatory approaches to our technology. So through legislation and the ensuing regulations that'll happen with foreign investment and how we control U.S. technology, we can achieve those same ends that the tariffs are also trying to achieve.
Okay. Robert, I'd like to know if you have a question for the panel. What is your question?
Yeah, I had a question. I was dealing with the Louisiana legislators. So in Louisiana, how can we kind of mitigate the impacts that, small businesses are feeling with our own legislation? I know obviously tariffs and that's a national, international issue that's legislated at the federal level, but is there steps that our own legislature in Baton Rouge can take to better protect farmers, better protect small business owners here in Louisiana?
I think we need to be cautious around that. If you believe tariffs work, then you would just build a wall around the United States and only consume what we produce. And if you think that's a real smart idea, we'll build a wall around Louisiana and only consume what we produce. And we have to be careful that we neck this down to where we have that immediate impact in our local communities. And passing legislation, I think, has to be we have to be very cautious in that regard, because we'll find ourselves isolated from the balance of the country and maybe even grow or expand the impact of those tariffs.
Okay.
I would want to jump in and say that I think there is some things we can do, whether in the state or domestically as a nation, that could mitigate some of this pressure that we speak of that causes or that comes from tariffs and international trade. Farmers, business owners, there's only so many things in their budget that they can control, And, you know, especially for farmers who are price takers, those few things, those few variables that they can control become exponentially important. So when you talk about things in the state like insurance costs, tort reform would be a great place to start. That would, while it's not directly related to the tariff situation, it still helps small business owners, loggers, farmers, just a citizen of this state, alleviate some of the pain that they're feeling from the reduced price that they're receiving by reducing the cost. There's very few things in a farmer's budget that he or she can control cost-wise, but those few things that they can control become just so important, and laws like that in the state could go a long way in helping us weather this storm.
And I would agree. Tort reform could clean up a lot of issues in commerce and in manufacturing and businesses in this state. That's certainly true, but we just must be careful that we don't become, isolationists, and we don't try to separate ourselves from a broader economy that can absorb the impact of these tariffs. And that's one of the things about tariffs, is that the cost is billions to our economy, but it's spread over 330 million people in the country. So if you reduce that to a more localized impact through legislation or politics or political action, you tend to ramp up that impact. So we just have to be careful in that arena.
Okay. Danielle, could you please give us your question for the panel?
Yes, it's been touched upon by Mr. Jim and Andy that this is not just a U.S. versus China tariff or war on trade. This is an international global war. Are there any countries that we could possibly try to get on our side as allies? To my knowledge, I don't think as of now that the president has asked any other country to join in or try to become allies with us in the issue.
So partnerships within.
Correct.
Yeah, so I can speak a little bit to that. First of all, it's important as we're looking to keep in mind who the United States has free trade agreements with. There's a number of countries that the United States has free trade agreements with, and so it's zero tariffs back and forth throughout South Korea, throughout the Caribbean, Latin America. There are a number of countries there, and additionally, the EU is also looking at how China is dealing with technology and how it's dealing with foreign investment. So there's a lot of pressure from other countries for China to also re-regulate how its internal, what we call infrastructure economy decisions are. And so the United States is working in that capacity. Unfortunately, because as was mentioned earlier, the United States is also in trade tensions with the EU, India, and a number of other countries. It's challenging because while they may agree on one portion of it, there's their own tensions that they're disputing within that. So.
Okay. Jim, do you have a question that you'd like to ask?
I think context is really important as we deal with this. I thoroughly agree with Scott broadly in terms of we can't become isolationists in this. We are connected to everything, whether we have a free trade agreement in place or not. But what we experience on Main Street is often the Amazoning of the economy, the loss of the retail sector locally. All of these things are connected. How do we play at a state level to get stronger, not from an isolationist standpoint, but to act in ways that make us more a part of the solutions and more connected to the markets?
Or very briefly answer, would it be diversification?
Yeah, that's exactly what I was thinking, and I think that's a nice parallel to thinking about, dealing in a broader economy. So not just thinking about Louisiana, thinking about the national economy and how we can be more integrated into the global economy. But I think if we are talking about Louisiana, what can we do within our state to be better positioned? I think continuing to diversify the economy, being ready to adapt and pursue new emerging segments of the economy, I think is a critical part of being more resilient in the future.
Okay.
We can also reemerge some industries like the furniture industry. There's only a handful left in this country, and it used to be that we produced 90% of what we consumed here. So we've got the people, the raw material, the opportunities to reinvigorate that industry, and I think that's a great way to diversify by re-engineering and reimagining that being part of our communities and part of our economy.
Well, that's just all the time we have for this show. We'd like to thank our panelists, Dr. Barnes, Mr. Brown, Mr. Poole, and Mr. Newsom for their input in tonight's topic. You can comment on this particular episode online at lpb.org/Public Square under the Join the Conversation tab. While you're there, you can also check out extended interview clips. We'd like to thank some very important people, the staff of the Coughlin Saunders Center for their assistance and hospitality, and very special thanks to Deborah Randolph and the Central Louisiana Chamber of Commerce and all their help. Good night, everyone. Thank you. Good show, everyone. Thanks. Give yourself a round of applause.
For a copy of this program, call 1-800-973-7246 or go online to www.lpb.org.